I'm Esther Dillard on the Black Information Network, chatting with writers and authors who offer an added perspective for our listeners. This is The Color Between the Lines. 1, 2, 3, 4. On this edition of The Color Between the Lines, we're speaking with an author that is talking about faith, about critiquing white supremacy in the Black church tradition and the Black church. The book we're talking about is The Day God Saw Me as Black, and the author is Danyelle Thomas. She is a faith and spirituality leader, as well as a founder of the Unfit Christian. Her work has been featured in Essence, the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, just to name a few. And we're going to get her thoughts on what some might describe as controversial points of view. Welcome, Danyelle Thomas, to the BIN.
Thank you for having me.
Well, this book dives deep into why you joined the ministry when you had some major concerns and criticisms about the Black church and what you believed as deep contradictions. And this is not new as far as folks who have been pulling out some of these contradictions. One reason, I believe, stemmed from the passing of your father. You wrote about in the chapter called The Preacher's Kid that you never thought you'd become a pastor or a leader in the church. But you did. Do you think that caring for your dad during his last days before he passed was the reason why?
No, I honestly never thought I would go into ministry. Um, but when he passed, it reminded me just how brief life is. And literally, I just didn't want to die with all of this conflict, with all of this wisdom, with all of this journey within me as far as my faith was concerned. Of course, his passing was a challenge to my faith. It challenged all the things that it had been normative to me about dealing with death and dealing with grief. It challenged that space that a lot of Christians find ourselves in, which is this idealization of all feelings must be good, right? We must still feel good even in the midst of some of the most worst parts of our human experience. I actually listened to Kirk Franklin today talk about this very thing on his Instagram, and he's talking about being in Florida and witnessing the devastation of these two hurricanes that have just passed, and talking about his frustration with the ways in which Christians like to throw scripture at everything and a lot of religious cliche at everything. And I found myself in that same location in dealing with my dad's passing. And so it led me to creating Unfit Christian and starting to have these conversations. I like to say that I was processing and thinking aloud, but even then, without the intention to become a pastor. But once folks started to tune in and start to find themselves identifying within my words and within my language, they sought me out in that way of being a leader, of giving and offering pastoral care. So I kind of fell into it, I like to say. I was voluntold to become a pastor as opposed to desiring to become one. But it's not a path that I regret. In healing other folks' relationship to the church by offering a different perspective or paradigm of a pastoral experience, I also healed my own. I became the kind of pastor and offered the kind of pastoral care that I wish I received in my time as a member of various churches.
You addressed the fact that you became conflicted with church philosophy and traditions when you started taking courses in college. And at one point you appeared that you were going to abandon the church altogether. What made you come back to the ministry, and how is your ministry different than what you grew up with?
I think for me, it always came down to this idea of core belief in the spirituality of Blackness and of Black people. I think more than the church, I think the church houses or in some ways entraps our spiritual expression. But I think Black folks just have this innate connection to spirit, this innate connection to something that is bigger and more divine than our mortal human existence. And for me, it was difficult to walk away from that altogether. For me, a separation from the spirit would also mean a separation from community. I think a lot of folks are very culturally Christian, if not professed Christians of faith. They at least have a deep cultural connection to what the Black church has offered to our community and what it has been established as part of our communal identity. So for me, I always put it this way. Blackness has outlived Jesus. It's older than Jesus. And whether or not I center my faith in this particular deity, there is still a deep connection to spirit for me that will not allow me to say it doesn't exist, it doesn't matter, that it's not something that I want to be part of my life. That connection to my culture and to my people supersedes any kind of fault or issue or umbrage I may take with the church. And there's certainly quite a few. But it matters to me to be in that deep community. And so I created that kind of community where people can show up as their whole selves. The reason the book is called The Day God Saw Me as Black is because for so many of us, we showed up in religious spaces having to compartmentalize parts of our identity. We could show up as the maybe gender self, but not the sexuality self. We can show up in Black church as the racial self, but maybe not the radical self that questions and interrogates the things that have been taught to us about our color and our identity and what that means for us in this world. So I created a space that I felt allowed folks to show up as their whole self, including their questioning self, including their agnostic self, including their not Christian self, and still have that space of community to connect to spirit and discuss the things of the spirit without the confines or at least most of the conflicts that many of us have experienced in traditional church spaces. So I think that's what differentiates my work is that it does offer that familiarity that most of us feel love and long for when we have been in community with the Black church, but also offers that freedom and liberation that many of us have been demanding from that institution, but haven't found.
In your chapter called Black and Ugly as Ever,
Mm-hmm.
you talk about some of the scriptures used over the years by white Christians as the reason for Black people not becoming successful and why they were subject as servants and much more. And in your opinion, are those things that you feel like the Black church has neglected to teach in those Sunday school classes and Bible classes because it's just too painful? Or do you think it's just something that they don't think that it's important to address?
I think, ironically enough, the Black church actually has a very, for the most part, or at least the one that I experienced, because there are different experiences of the Black church now. I can admit to that when I think of some of the popular um, sound bites that are coming out from the Black church these days that sound very white supremacist in nature. But the one I grew up with had a very strong Black ethic and politics and identity. So those things were talked about. The problem is that supremacy doesn't begin and end with our enslavement, right? It is literally this idea of dehumanizing Black bodies as less than. And so our teachings around racial identity may be very Black, but our teachings around sex are supremacist. Our teachings around gender are supremacist. Our teachings around every other facet of most of our identities tend to be rooted and grounded in a very supremacist theology. And so I think that is where the issue comes in. And this separation, this striation, if you will, for most folks' engagement with this institution belongs there. It's like you're Black, yes, but everything else that you've taught me about myself is anti-Black and engages in deep anti-Blackness. And so I don't think the church is afraid to approach race, but I do think it is afraid to approach the idea that its theology in every other regard is a rearticulation of white supremacy.
Mm. For those of you who are just joining us, I'm Esther Dillard with the Black Information Network, and we're speaking with spiritual leader and writer Danyelle Thomas, who is a founder of the Unfit Christian and the author of the book The Day God Saw Me as Black. You address a lot of different points in this book, but I believe what I wonder. I wanted to make sure that you got out what you wanted readers to come away with as far as the central message and you be able to articulate that.
Yeah, absolutely. I always want folks to know when they are reading this book, first of all, I'm not proselytizing to you. I have no interest in making you Christian or taking away from your beliefs. What I want you to know is that there is room to consider who you are and how God sees you, because it matters how God sees you. You can only receive the God that you understand. And the only way you understand God is through your oppression. You will begin to associate oppression with holiness. You will begin to associate it with what makes you redeemed, with what has saved you, as opposed to what may be hindering you from having life abundant here. So when folks read this book, I don't ask them to think what I think. I simply want them to take the material and think about it. I'll never tell you what to think. I just want you to think. So when you walk away, I want you to walk away knowing that you have room to question God, to question your identity, to question how your understanding of God had served you or not served you, and trust that God it has room for all of this. I think a lot of us were given an understanding of God that is very narrow, that doesn't allow questioning, that doesn't allow contemplation. I think, at least from my experience, we grew up in a space and an institution that demonized intellectual curiosity. So I want folks to know that you can be curious and you can still love God. You can be angry about your experience in this world at the point of your intersections of gender, class, race, sexuality, ability, etc., so forth, and still have a God that loves you. Or you can decide that you don't see yourself reflected in this experience and choose how to move forward in a way that feels satisfactory to you. The day God saw me as Black is merely a turning point. It is not a final destination. It is literally a way in which for folks to begin to reframe their thinking and identity as it comes to their relationship with God and how that relationship is then related to every other part of the community that they are part of. Yeah.
It's funny, but when I was reading the book, I kind of felt like it was part of it, not only is the day God saw me as Black, but as feminine, because the
Yeah.
feminine is a very big part of how people relate in the church, because
Yeah.
it's their very masculine, you know,
Absolutely.
yeah, part of the church where feminine being feminine and being able to be outspoken is
Right.
kind of like a dichotomy there. And
Right.
you bring that out in the book a lot.
I do, because for me, as a Black woman, I live in an experience where misogynoir dictates I never know if the discrimination is because of my race or my gender. There is no beginning and there is no end. And in Black spaces, particularly the institutional Black church, where I should find respite from racism, I am still dealing with what it means to be a Black woman in spaces where Black women are not always loved, where we're not always welcomed, even though we serve in so many capacities of making the church a safe space. We serve in the capacity of making folks feel welcome literally in our sanctuaries. And often we are bullied out of the pulpits, or if we get access to it, it is to continue to uphold patriarchy and not to do work of liberation. And so it's very important for me to talk about that experience because the Black women or women in general, not even just Black women, when you look at a Christian church, the majority of its attendance is women. We literally create these churches. We sustain their membership by our direct participation, but also as the people who bear children. And that, of course, includes, non-binary folks who are able to bear children. But we produce the next generation. We are the people who keep this going. We keep the lights on, quite literally. So to not include us and to not make that our voices matter, and for many of us to then internalize that oppression as normative and to not see an option otherwise, because like the religious text normalizes or has been used to normalize racism, it has also been used to normalize and sanctify sexism. So I wanted to offer people a different perspective, a different way of seeing their feminine, or I should say non-masculine identity, because I want to include people who are of all marginalized genders and that may not be cisgender identity as well. But as a Black cisgender woman, it was extremely important to me to lift that up, um, because if not for the women, there would be no gospel. Quite
Mm.
literally, it is Jesus appears to women first when he is resurrected. So without the women, there would be no gospel of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And for me, having gone through so much of my religious experience, being shaped and molded by women, my mother being my first sight or first touch of what God is, and the women preachers who raised me and shaped me. I could not have written this book without the central idea of what it means to be seen as both Black and feminine, and those things together.
Well, Danyelle Thomas, we appreciate your time and thank you for joining us on the BIN.
Thank you for having me.
Well, that's it for this edition of The Color Between the Lines. My name is Esther Dillard. The book is called The Day God Saw Me as Black. This is the Black Information Network.